You are listening to the Baobab Project. Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us under the Baobab tree from wherever you are in the world today. We are joining you from Halifax, Nova Scotia. We've got so much to explore, from culture to lifestyle to health, relationships, education, and so much more. Now over to our podcast host for today.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. You're under the Baobab tree, and I'm excited to have so many folks in the audience. Today I have with me Leah. She will introduce herself relatively shortly, but we have been working on this podcast, Heroism, Racism, the number 2 Construction Battalion, as part of a 3-part series, African Heritage Month special that we're doing for our podcast. This podcast has been going on for a year now. We began in March of last year to do a 12-part series, and we're almost at the end of this 12-part series. Actually, we're headed to a 20-part series after all. But overall, we're enjoying every session that we have. And today, as I've mentioned, Heroism, Racism, the number 2 Construction Battalion, the lead interviewer today is Leah, and I'll hand it right over for her to introduce herself.
So I'm certainly privileged to be here and honored to speak with all of you. This certainly is an area that is both fascinating and I'm really interested to learn a lot more about it. My name's Leah Jones. I'm doing my practicum here with Black Student Support Services. And I wanted to begin today with just a brief discussion about socially produced racism and the formation of racialized spaces. Prejudice certainly permeates society in various ways, and its use as a weapon of control demonstrates how effectively a culture can be shaped to accept exclusion. Canada touts its multicultural society of inclusion and acceptance, and though this may exist partially in the current day, Canada has not been innocent of violent racism or ignorant exclusion. Racialized communities demonstrate how space is something socially produced, whether it was a space of exclusion, like segregation, refusal of enlistment, or a space created for ethnicity solely to segregate other ethnicities from white-owned privileges and limit interaction. The space was not created in an era of acceptance or tolerance. This is socially produced racism. Today we're talking about racialized spaces and the formation of the number 2 Construction Battalion, often referred to as the Black Battalion, who played a crucial role in World War I. Despite refusing to allow its Black citizens to fight for its defense during World War I, a group of young Black men, desperate to join the fight, battled for enlistment. They formed the number 2 Black Battalion, 1916 to 1920, and hailed as Canada's best kept military secret. We're fortunate enough to have Sylvia as our guest today. Sylvia's account and knowledge will help explain why it's essential to learn about the number 2 Construction Battalion. She'll also help us understand the level of community and support and the impact for returning soldiers and their families going forward. Sylvia, could you take a moment to introduce yourself?
Thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Sylvia Paris-Drummond.
For that, how about we just jump right into the questions? Sylvia, could you recount for us what it was like being a part of a family history of generations of enlisted men? I recognize that at least 3 generations served. What's it like being part of a military family?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think because my commentary in terms of the number 2 Construction Black Battalion is one from reflection. So it's not one that was like in the experience of the time when my father was still with us here, and we were talking about that experience because of the denial to tell that true story. So what I know about in terms of being within a military family, as we say, that what I know about is a family of pride, a family that really was about action and social justice. And so my father served in the battalion. I had older brothers who served in the Navy, who had fought in the wars, the more current wars. So what I can imagine from that line of engagement in such battles is what they actually brought with them was from their experience of fighting for rights, fighting often for their own rights in terms of in the human race. And I can imagine that being a contributing factor to wanting to serve in spite of the racist acts that they all encountered during their times, but particularly, as we know, in terms of the learning story now about the battalion.
Could you give us an idea about some of this perspective that's been shared with you about the No. 2 Construction Battalion?
Right. So we know that the ability for Black men to fight in the war was supported by not just their desire to fight and continuing to enlist and then being denied and finally coming to form this construction group, this group of Black men from not only from Nova Scotia or Canada, but also from the States as well. And so what we know was that the community and the church were the voices of the time that also agitated for these men to be able to fight in the war. So there's this aspect that is always about agitating for yourself, supporting each other in a cause that the communities desired to, in this case, in terms of fighting in the war, to invest in. We always have kind of in our history about this type of thing, we have our first person voices, our community leaders, and we often have the church, and in this case through Reverend Wright, also representing.
Thanks, Sylvia. I'll jump in with the next question. And I just want you to reflect on the experiences that your father might have had while enlisting. And you've mentioned at the beginning there that you weren't around when your father, you weren't around in 1920. So that's obvious that you weren't around when your father was enlisted. But what would it have been like, based on what you have heard or what you know? What would that experience of enlisting be like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a number of things. So in terms of my father, had passed away when I was in junior high, and so the times to be able to even talk to him about that experience weren't easy to come by. And so what we could imagine at that time of being enlisted was, I think, somewhat the same energy you might think about as a young man. He was 17 years old. He also had a brother who was going to actually go fight as well. So if you think about it and think about ourselves as young folks and young men at that time, I think there would have been excitement about going off. You're going to France, you're going to another, place you haven't been before, the country, whatever. So there would have been that, but tainting all of that was the treatment, right? And so as we've already talked about, this battalion came about from the perspective of Black men not being allowed to fight alongside white men. It was called the White Man's War. So they needed their own space. But also what contributed to the battalion being established was they also needed more bodies. They needed more men in this war. So even at that time, there still was an aspect about pushing in and for that need. And so while you would have the camaraderie of your brothers of community, you would have had the disdain of other units who were kind of connected with you because, for example, with this, the way the force worked, you went before the soldiers who were carrying the guns. Remember, you weren't carrying guns, you were carrying picks and shovels. And so you went before them in the trenches to make the way, right? And so there's lots of messaging about how you were valued and devalued. And what I think shows up generationally for me and my family and in other Black community families was that really important sense of pride and you needed to know yourself you were doing something that was contributing to the good.
Thank you. That's really well answered. And, I'm kind of feeling emotional already, and we're just a third way into this discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm going to jump around a little bit because I just want to bridge what you were saying about what they were walking into. I would say, looking back, I think that education and information flow would be limited at this time, and that enlisted men wouldn't have access to communication between commanders and administration, and not necessarily be aware of the racism they would meet on the battlefield.
Yeah, I mean, sorry to jump in on that one, but I feel like that almost to think about that is almost would be aspirational, not not in terms of reality. And what I mean by that is because we experience the burden of racism every day in so many ways. We talk about microaggressions, subtle acts of exclusion, those type of things. The reality of racism was always there for us in community, and certainly for those men in the war. What I think I will attach to in terms of that disconnect in communication was, again, some of how that might show up, because we read about how they didn't get the same rations as other units were extended. And we often don't get to talk about, for the other units that exist, not just the forestry one, in which this one is under, but others as well, where there were Black men in other units or other aspects for whatever reasons that happened, because we would need to kind of note that, somewhat like was in the education system, there wasn't really an explicit, like you on the policy books that said a Black man could not be enlisted in a predominantly white unit, for example. It was the practice that excluded them, and the practice was so blatant that we needed to have this separate unit formed. However, everybody was experiencing these acts of racism, deliberate acts in terms of actions, which we often think about, but also the exclusion things where you could ask for something and people would act like they didn't even hear you ask it, right? Or you would know that in a cycle of time being in the war, you probably needed new sets of socks or boots or whatever. And so those things were not coming, or not easily coming, to this Black unit and to these men. And so I often, use the word, and I'll use it here now, I can only imagine how tremendously destructive that was to someone's soul. And so often when we talk about how our community is steeped in faith and in spirituality, that is what we're talking about as well, in terms of surviving and what we have often turned into thriving.
Yes, I in reading about this and in doing research, my journey with this started with one particular soldier that didn't make it back. And I came across the communications, which is why I brought up about the communication flow, because I came across telegrams and communique going back and forth as they were fighting to be able to enlist. And I thought, something as hard as it is to hear is important for our listeners to hear. A telegram from W.H. Allen, the lieutenant colonel that was commanding the 106th Overseas Battalion, who they would have been going to report to. And when he was asked to accept Black enlisted men, he wrote, "Several white men who had been about to sign on refused to do so if colored men were to be admitted in the regiment. Still, if I had my choice, I would prefer white men. And if the enlistment of colored men is going to prevent better men from signing on, it seems to me that the best thing to do would be to keep them separated. Neither my men nor I would care to sleep alongside them or eat with them, especially in warm weather. A white man's appetite is a peculiar thing."
Wow. Isn't that amazing to think that someone would thinking that was a credible thing to write and to say?
Mm-hmm.
right? And think about though, in that, and this kind of goes to when we're trying to struggle with understanding this whole thing about systemic racism and the embeddedness of it. Because what empowered him to say that was that the system was welcoming that, because he didn't get fired, right?
Yeah.
You know, and so that's the insidious thing that we need to be mindful about as we hear these stories, and why you know, and we had said, like, these stories are hard on our heart, and when people share them and talk about them, the depth of the learning that should come from them is what we hold people who are accountable in terms of active listening to them. Because what that message was about, besides this individual may saying something, was that we had a whole system that was totally fine with that.
I think on the back of that, I'd like to ask, knowing what they're already battling and dealing with, from a mother-daughter perspective, why do you think your father enlisted?
Yeah, so what I've reflected on is that I think, you know, I mean, so Joseph Alexander Paris, in that picture, he looks fabulous. He's strapping, and we say a strapping young man in that suit, 17. You got the uniform, you're going off. So I could imagine that. There was some pay, as I understand. I don't know the range, and I don't know how they differentiated that in terms of black, white, and or what that was like. But there was some pay that you could be bringing to support your family as well. And I just think, like, this possibility of maybe starting to own your place in community and society again, because you were stepping up to the call of duty, if I might frame it that way. And the other aspect I think about, and I think it's common across, you know, our communities as well. So our kind of ancestral lineage in terms of migrations here is connected with the Black loyalists on my father's side and my mom's side. And so there's also this thing about being in, what's the phrase, in the DNA of the struggle, right? So we're used to, you know, we brought that with us in terms of the struggle for what's right. Because remember, we were fighting for a righteous cause. So I think that, as well as, like I said, some of the socializing around what it might be like to be a soldier, where it's probably in his mind as well. I think my mom, as I would be, I think as a mom, you know, or his mom, sorry, like I would be as a mom, would have been, you know, it would have been a stress time to think about your son's going off to war, you know, in that regard as well. So.
Mm. And Sylvia, as I think of this too, you know, I would be considering, as a father, I would be considering, if my experience in the in coming in with the in the 1700s in Nova Scotia, being promised land and promised a whole lot of things, and as a community we got nothing.
Yes.
Then why would I want my child to go fight in a war to be promised something else?
Mm-hmm.
Right? You know, that would be quite difficult for a mother to take. But like you said, it is in your DNA. You know, this is something that many people of African ancestry can attest to, is that, you know, we never stop fighting. And I really like how you put that all together. I think one of the things that can help the audience to better understand your father's experience and the experiences of those who were in the community at that time is the level of education. Because, you know, I think many people will say, you know, who are these folks? Haven't heard all of these things. Why would they still enlist? So can you help us to understand what the education system would have been like, the formal, informal education system, and just to shed light on the kind of support and the kind of knowledge and education that has been passed on to these men?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, the folks gained their education through the connections and support and the church, right? And people didn't kind of informal education in the schooling, public schooling, like, so, you know, you often left that early to go to work, to be working to support to support your family. Also, remember, we would have schools that were segregated schools in terms of access to resources and location. I just wanted to distinguish that out from what happened in segregated schools, where we saw each other, and we saw each folks from our community. So we had this community connection that was kind of a pride piece, and yet you were denied access to the book resources, the other resources that should have been afforded to you to actually have great success. So, you often hear people, they finish school at grade 3, they finish school at grade 8. You often hear stories too, in storytelling in the community about, that would make you say, well, I need to figure out what that would be equivalent to in these days. So it's not that easy just to say those grades and then think about today, because we also need to think about what the education was like in a broader sense as well, holistic in terms of what you had to do, an expectation in terms of a Bible, and that's where your reading was connected with the Bible as well. And then, for us kind of coming into the learning time, which we've, I think, just kind of hinted to a bit, was what was valid to be taught, right? What was it you were going to be able to learn, quote unquote, air quotes, easily through the public school system, because it was accessible in the books that you were reading. The teachers who were teaching you knew all that information. So that aspect of the education is another denial for us in terms of Black community, because those stories, that knowledge was not shared in that way at all. And so there wasn't access for that, for you to know about those contributions, and all of that, significant amount of that searching for that knowledge was done on from your own resources.
Thank you. I just want to remind the audience that you're under the Baobab tree, and the discussion today is on heroism, racism, the number 2 Construction Battalion, and we have our lead interviewer is Leah Jones, and my name is Randy Headley, and we're interviewing Sylvia Paris Drummond on this topic. And Leah, you can continue.
Well, I found a book by Calvin Ruck, The Black Battalion, Canada's Best Kept Military Secret, and there were some gripping quotes in there. I pulled a couple. The story of overt racist treatment of Black volunteers is a shameful chapter in the history of this country. It does, however, represent an important part of the Black legacy and the Black experience. So coming from a white settler perspective, I find I'm stuck on understanding why it was important to fight for the right to fight for a country that didn't treat you as one of its own citizens. Why would these men decide to lay down their life for a country that didn't support them or their community?
Yeah, really thoughtful question. So one answer could be why indeed. But actually, what I would like to say in an answer is this. If we think about it from the perspective of the individual, and in this case as well, our collective Black community, what's the value that we have in ourselves? What is it we know about our own concerns, our own commitment, right? So folks went forward with, this is a war. This is a war that is supposed to be about freedom, right? I could sit around and say, I could say, like, if I was maybe trying to voice my father, my daddy, maybe I sit around and say, listen, no one has done me any favors. I've struggled. I'm continuing to struggle. What's the point of me going? I mean, some people would accept that. I think in terms of what we look at in terms of our community and how we have been about surviving, that would not be something that, again, would be in our psyche way of being. We would be thinking about, this is affecting my family too. And so I need to figure out a way, I want to figure out a way to go in and be part of the response to this war, because my family live here. We are identifying ourselves as Canadians, and whatever in this time. We live here. We're fighting for the cause and the bigger cause. And we're having to figure out to address the issues that are the anti-Black, anti-racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Black, anti-racism issues. We have to address that, again, as individuals and as a community. However, we are thinking, I don't know for the best phrase for it might be, Leah, is we're thinking the long run and the big picture.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, another thing I uncovered is before they left for battle, there was a parade through downtown Halifax. So I'm just wondering about the response and the pride behind being allowed to enlist, and whether it was parental or community pressure that motivated these young men. I mean, I read some of the enlistment papers. They were 15 years old, forging their age and identity, and off they went. So I'm wondering about this, kind of on the back of what you were talking about.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Well, there's, so there's two parts in there. There's definitely pride, general pride in the community. And as I said, it was the community who agitated for that. At that time, there was a significant number of population in Truro, for example. So you'll often hear that Truro is acknowledged for part of that in terms of that work. And then New Glasgow is where the unit itself had clustered as well. So we are proud to be supporting each other in the community, in the Black community. So this choice was made. These folks, these young men, and as you acknowledged, not of age. My father was not of age when he enlisted. We're going to support them going for that choice that they were able to make, and for the cause that they were moving toward.
Yeah, interesting. And Sophia, I heard you mention this on several occasions, whereby the community, the church, had a significant influence on these men being enlisted. And I know within the Black communities, and more specifically the African Nova Scotian communities, the church is central, right? And you spoke quite often of these men having community pride and all those kinds of things. It's not necessarily family pride. I'm fighting on behalf of the parish or something of that sort. It's more like they're taking on this burden of a community, of a people. So what kind of influence do you think the community would have had on these young men enlisting? And if you can help us to like just draw this visual picture for us in terms of somebody calling and say, "Hey Joe, it's your turn to go." Right? What kind of influence does the community have on these men?
I mean, we feel a deep and committed accountability for each other and responsibility for each other. And I think, sometimes the articulating of that, we probably could strengthen it, because you kind of live it and do it. And so then you got to pull back and go, okay, so if I was thinking about that and talking about it out loud, what would that look like? And so in kind of in imagining at that time, and then in seeing how it shows up and continually, there would have been like, okay, you are healthy enough, you're physically able to enlist. This is an expectation in terms of our collective community, as you said, not just kind of Paris board and mom, dad type thing, family, but in the collective. And so if I talk about that in that way, for our experience, that's Guysborough County. Like my parents' roots are into Monastery, Rare Monastery, Mulgrave, Sandpoint, Sunnyvale, whatever. So all of those areas are in this as well, in this discussion. And when we think about what it is we need to do to help for our community, we think about it in this kind of bigger picture way about how we do things. And so that shows up even in what the expectations are. Like, for example, in families, in terms of expectations about what you would do, say, even around employment, we would like want to see come out of our communities, to fill roles that are vacant roles. So, to go into jobs that are seen as beneficial to our community, needed to our community. So if you showed, quote unquote, air quotes again, promise, then, you were going to be, reminded, supported to go towards, various things: nurse, doctor, teacher, engineer, whatever, right? So we know that now, we see it played out. So if you think back in terms of what would have been happening around that time as well, it was the same type of thing. You were not walking out as, in this case, we're talking about like as Joseph Alexander Paris or, William Winslow Paris. You were walking out with that name, and that name was walking out in terms of Black community, African Nova Scotian community representation, right? So you were walking and holding up Guysborough County, right? And actually with Rare Monastery going a bit into Antigonish County. So you were like walking in that way as well. And what's interesting for me when you reflect or think on some of these things, some of that way of being is just, it's just this way of being. So when we use this phrase about it's just the way we are, and then we kind of grasp to find the words to help folks who don't have that beautiful experience to learn it, we do have to pull back a little bit and think about the exampling, but it's just the way you are. And then for those who were still here, for the families who were still here, for the mums and stuff, whatever, they were supporting each other. If I had my crops, my, whatever, or I had an orchard for fruits, I was sharing those things. If I had, livestock, I was sharing those things. And it's the same thing now in terms of how we understand about this aspect, about how it carries through. So you can almost think in a way about I don't know, it's like circular in a loop. So we see these things show up, but they were the way we were in the beginning, right? In terms of supporting each other and having expectations about each other, and not just expectations in the sense about, I want you to do something, but expectations, I know you have the capabilities and the possibilities there, and we are going to go together, hand holding metaphorically or in reality, to help you reach that potential.
That was nicely said. And all I can think of, Sylvia, is I'm going to war, not on my own accord, not on my family's accord, but there's a community behind me. I have so much to live for, and I'm coming back because there's a whole lot of people looking for me when I come back. So, as I just think of those men leaving Guysborough and leaving Nova Scotia, because there are many communities that they came from, I can just imagine them not carrying the burden of their community, but going there with the support of their communities, knowing that the communities will take care of their families when they leave and those kinds of things, and not having to worry. I can just see, and the community trying to make it as easy as possible, knowing that these men are not only going to fight war, they'll be fighting racism, they'll be fighting everything else to survive. So I can just imagine what it felt like for those men back there. All right, so I want to remind everyone that we're under the Baobab tree, and the podcast recording that we're doing today, it's on heroism, racism, the number 2 Construction Battalion. The lead interviewer today is Leah Jones. My name is Randy Headley, and we're interviewing Sylvia Paris Drummond, who's sharing her personal experiences, and we're really pleased to have thus far heard and envisioned and experienced some of what has happened so long ago. We're thankful for your recount of all that has happened from the perspective of a daughter who has learned these information from her dad. Leah, you want to continue?
Yes, I think you've certainly helped paint a picture of the how and the why, and the pride of off they went. What did the soldiers return to? I mean, it took 10 years for Black soldiers to be allowed into the Legion. Why do you think it took this long?
Yeah, I mean, it's rooted in what we had talked about, and even in terms before when you talked about the example of the written letter that denied humanness of folks, like that these Black folk could not, we had good men, we were going to lose if they were allowed to fight beside them. So that continued. That was still embedded in the system and in the structures that existed. And so as much as people were able to, again, because they were permitted to do that based on policy, written and unwritten and practices, they were permitted to make that denial happen. And so it was really that continued. And I think for the folks, certainly the individuals, but again, let's just say in terms of the structures of the time, to look into that, to see that was about, because we might wonder what was their issue in terms of not valuing themselves enough that they could see themselves alongside diversity, right? As we talk about it now, but alongside Black men, African Nova Scotian men, African Canadian men at that time. I feel like I would want to say to them, I was talking to them, what's your problem? You don't value yourself enough that you need to treat someone else worse so that you can be putting yourself up by putting someone down? Because that's what it certainly has the feeling of that was happening. So I think in terms of what was happening in that time, I can only kind of think about it from that perspective, because you had soldiers who came back with a knowledge about what it was like to be in those trenches, to be in that horror, to be hungry, to be cold, in the same way you as a white man who's making some decisions, in this case you mentioned about legions and other things, would have had or have known about. Why do you need to treat someone badly, just to put it mildly, so that you can feel better about yourself?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it really struck me as I was reading the point where the author brought up that they stepped onto the field and were handed a shovel instead of a gun. And I just thought, I think my fear quotient would have gone through the roof at that point. In 2016, the No. 2 Construction Battalion was honored with a permanent domestic stamp and finally added to the Great Canadian War Heroes list. And then along with the 10 years to get into the Legion, why do you think it took 100 years to recognize and honor the Black Battalion?
I'm not sure about, saying the length of time, but if it wasn't for the community agitating, it probably wouldn't have, 100 years would have still been, it still would not have maybe have occurred. And what I mean by that is, so you mentioned Calvin Ruck. We've had retired Captain George Borden, God rest his soul, both their souls, that was continuously, finding documentation, getting themselves at tables where they could be heard, doing interviews of folks for the time, so many things that they had to do, and others that could be named here as well. It was that story of community leaders, not giving up, finding the information, making the case until finally there was enough there in that, if I said metaphorically, in a stack of papers in front of someone, that they couldn't turn away. They had to acknowledge the battalion.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, my last quote from Calvin's book sticks with me. It's how he closed his book. And he said, "A man is not to be remembered for fighting, but what he was fighting for. The men of the No. 2 Black Construction Battalion entered and left the battlefield with dignity, class, and their head held high, and that's what they will continue to be remembered for." So in all of this, fighting to get enlisted, fighting to be recognized for the enlistment, fighting to be recognized on the return, what should society do to ensure that these memories are not lost?
Well, as somebody who used to teach in the public school system and that post-secondary and was involved in curriculum development work, ensuring that it is accessible in education is important. That story, the story of the battalion, the delving into the meaning, the valuing of folks' commitment to family, to community, the role of community and family, interrogating the aspects of systemic racism and how that is so embedded and how that needs to be addressed. I think, for me, those are some of the things that need to happen. And I think, and we might think through kind of conversations that are maybe happening around now, like you can just feel confident, maybe I'll say this way, I feel confident in saying they went to fight for freedom for the country, right? Because they knew their freedoms before they left, they knew their freedoms there were curtailed by a belief, a negative belief, and not just a belief, which would be a prejudice and maybe / bias, but an enacting of that, which is the racism in terms of policies and practices and procedures to treat them in a less than equitable, less than equal way, right? So, but they knew that, they knew their experience, and they probably felt we're going to come back to some of the things that we left. Not genuine access to employment, not genuine access to education, right? But still freedom for all of our community, for the freedom that was fought for under the name of that war. We're going for that reason. And I mean, how can I not be like, just overwhelmed with pride of my father and my uncle, but overwhelmed with pride of my community? And how can I not want to walk straight and tall and do things to the best of my ability? I owe them that.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to be, part of that motivation is to really nail down your rights as a citizen. If I have the right to live here, I have the right to fight for where I live as well. It's another battle for human rights in the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, rights and your voice to speak for yourself, and to speak on behalf of your community as they placed you to do so, right? And that we have this really important aspect about being in terms of our elders and the value of our elders and their voice, and it doesn't change up like depending on your status in terms of a title, whatever, right? What's important in terms of community is that eldership in terms of like how people are valuing those who have lived long usually, but also lived deeply and caring in terms of community. So that ability to be fully who we are as a community is something that we have been fighting for as well, and that would have been part of that battle of that time.
Oh, that's awesome. And Sylvia, I'm going to wrap up by sharing an African proverb, as I've often liked to do. As we think of these men enlisting, leaving their homes, going to fight a war, end up on the battlefield and is handed a shovel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe to play ping pong with bullets coming their way, or maybe it's to bury them. The African proverb that said, they tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And just look at how the community lived to tell this story, and they're flourishing today. I'm amazed at how resilient the African Nova Scotian community is. And I agree that these stories are not only African Nova Scotian stories. These are stories that belong to all of us, all Canadians. And it has been neglected for many, many years in our textbook and in our own communities. And I'm happy that we've had the opportunity to expand and to share and to talk further about the experiences of these men from 1916 to 1920, the number 2 Construction Battalion. Another African proverbs to really end, it says, a man who pays respect, and I'll say a man or woman, a person who pays respect to the great paves the way for his own greatness. And I'm hoping, Sylvia, that as you continue to reflect on your father's contribution to this country, that we in 100 years from now will recognize the work and your contribution to our community and society. Thank you all for listening, participating. We'll have an opportunity to ask questions right after we end the recording. I just want to remind you that we're under the baobab tree, and our discussion today, heroism, racism, the number 2 Construction Battalion. I'm here with my co-host, Leah Jones. My name is Randy Hadley, and our trusty panelist today was Sylvia Paris Drummond, and I want to thank you for your contribution today, Sylvia and Leah.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Leah.